All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we check into great theories, discoveries, and concepts that have been suppressed, things that the powers that be want to shield from you, and they require a great amount of digging. And this, I would say, is more of a truther channel. It's the stuff that even the truthers have not dug up quite yet because they have spent most of their time digging into the psychological operations of the 20th century and the 21st century. Haven't gone back deep enough into their psyches and their addictions and the things that uh, they're going to need to sacrifice eventually. All of us are going to have a total overhaul of our, you know, the way we do things. And so far, most of us are still pretty comfy, still pretty, much the way that we were beforehand. We might think that we've gone through some type of transformation, and that is true, but it hasn't gone deep enough yet. And that's what I'm here for, and that's what this channel is here for. So this is our 379th Bible Decode. And so we check into things that your priest or pastor, minister, rabbi will not tell you, even if you ask them. And they probably don't know it themselves. And there are things that are going to cut to the quick about uh, these two biblical religions. Um, and they are fraudulent for different reasons. But we've been focusing on the New Testament that is fraudulent because it was written by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty in the late first century. They backdated the story of Jesus by 40 plus years, um, and it is fiction. It was written as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Jews were waiting on a Messiah to help them in their ongoing battle against the Romans, and they were hoping that this Messiah was going to be a military commander to deliver them from the Romans, to kick them out of Judea. So instead, the Romans wrote the Gospels about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And so, um, and otherwise being utterly deferential to the Romans. Nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus do anything against the Romans. Um, Although he does overturn the tables of the Jewish money changers and castigate the Jewish merchants selling small animals for the Jewish sacrifices, and told his Jewish followers that they needed to abandon their families. And so Jesus is taking direct aim at, and so is Paul, at the Jewish rituals and traditions that were such a difficult thing for the Romans to govern. So the so you should be able to smell a rat immediately, that this whole gospel is a benefit to the Romans. And then you also just need to apply some common sense. The Romans had the biggest empire in the history of the world to that time, and um, they had full control of censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire. So nothing is going to be published and distributed in the Roman Empire unless the Roman Caesars approved of it. You know, um, you know, these gospel documents um, are not going to be out there unless the Romans did it. And in particular, it was done by a Roman who wrote under the name Josephus, a Roman or a group of Romans. I think it's more like a family of Romans. And that is how you decode the New Testament, is by, or at least the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Luke, by reading Josephus's War of the Jews alongside your Gospels and recognizing that they are going through um, um, parallel stories, and that the story of Jesus is just a mirror of the story of General Titus, um, the Roman general who fought this war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And that General Titus eventually becomes the second Flavian emperor, Emperor Titus. And that's the pattern. And then you can also see the pattern in Josephus himself as he describes his own life and his own experiences, which are fictional, in my opinion, but they are also uh, mirrored by Jesus's life. And there are many, many, many other parallels that are documented by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. It turns out that Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe both knew what the deal was, and all of Shakespeare's plays are actually about the fact that the Romans wrote the New Testament, um, including his most famous play, Romeo and Juliet, the Romans and the Jews. And Christopher Marlowe knew the deal before he was murdered, and many other writers of literature throughout the ages have also known these facts, including some of your favorite Christian authors such as Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Um, so this is not just coming out of no place. But you can also check out the work of Michael Menescot's, his book Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, where he digs up over 250 strong parallels between the work of Josephus and the book of Luke. Just in the book of Luke, there are 250 parallels. And then when you graph them on a chart, all of the parallels in the book of Luke, the graph makes 5 near perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars, APTVS. I suggest that the T and the V are Titus Vespasian, Vespasian being Titus's father. The AP may be Arius Piso, the real identity of Josephus. And but the basic gist, regardless of what those letters actually stand for, is that the Romans literally signed their names to the Gospels, just waiting for us to decode it. And it apparently has taken almost 2,000 years. But when the Romans wrote this New Testament, they wanted to look convincingly like a religion and really like a universal religion. This has been something that they had been planning and something that they executed over the course of several generations. It was a family affair for the Piso family. And as a result, they put everything that they could get their, everything that they could get their hands on into the Gospels. Every kind of world religion, mythology from India, China, Mexico, Egypt, Scandinavia, Britain, and other far-flung places, um, philosophy from Egypt, Persia, Greek, Roman philosophy, mystery religions, astrology, shamanism, alchemy, and whatever they could put their hands on. And so that's what we're looking at today, is just some of the evidence of that, in the book from Kersey Graves, his 1876 book called 16 Crucified Saviors, where he goes over some of the 16 crucified saviors and their stories that mirror the stories of Jesus, but they are hundreds or even thousands of years older than the story of Jesus, which shows that these are some of the sources that the Romans used to concoct the story in the Gospels. Now, we're about to start chapter 17 here, which is called the Athanasia, or darkness at the crucifixion. Matthew tells us in chapter 27, verse 31, that when Christ was crucified, there was darkness over all the land for 3 hours, and the earth did quake, and the rocks were rent, and many of the saints came out of their graves. Here we have a series of events spoken of so strange, so unusual, and so extraordinary that had they occurred, they must have attracted the attention of the whole world, especially the amazing scene of the sun's withdrawing its light and ceasing to shine, and thereby causing an almost total darkness near the middle of the day. And yet no writer of that age or country, or any other age or country, mentions the circumstance but Matthew. A phenomenon so terrible and so serious in its effects as literally to unhinge the planets and partially disorganize the universe must have excited the alarm and amazement of the whole world and caused a serious disturbance in the affairs of nations. And yet strange, superlatively strange, not one of the numerous historians of that age makes the slightest allusion to such an astounding event. Even Seneca and the elder Pliny, who so particularly and minutely chronicled the events of those times, are as silent as the grave relative to this greatest event in the history of the world. Nor do Mark, Luke, or John, who all furnish us with a history of the crucifixion, make the slightest hint at any of these wonder exciting events except Mark's incidental allusion to the darkness. Gibbon says, quote, "It happened during the life of Seneca and the elder Pliny, who must have experienced its immediate effects or received the earliest intelligence of the prodigy. Each of these philosophers, in a labored work, has recorded all the phenomena of nature's earthquakes, meteors, and eclipses, which his indefatigable curiosity could collect. Both the one and the other have omitted to mention the greatest phenomenon to which the mortal eye has been witness since the creation of the world." With reference to the bodies of the dead saints coming out of their tombs, it's in Matthew 27:52. Many rather curious and puzzling questions might be started, which would at once disclose its utter absurdity. We might ask, for example, who were those many saints who came out of their graves, seeing there were as yet but few Christians to occupy graves, if they had been all dead, as the enumeration at Antioch made out only 120? How long, that's in the book of Acts somewhere. How long had they lain in their graves? How long since their bodies had turned to dust and been food for worms? And would not those worms have to be hunted up and required to disgorge the contents of their stomachs in order to furnish the saints with the materials for their bodies again? And were the shrouds or grave clothes of those saints also resurrected, or did they travel around in a state of nudity? For what purpose were they reanimated? And should not Matthew have furnished us, by way of proof, with the names of some of these ghostly visitors? How long did they live the second time? Did they die again, or did they ascend to heaven with their new made bodies? What business did they engage in? Why have we not some account of what they said and did, and what finally became of them? Until these questions are rationally answered, the story must be regarded as too incredible and too ludicrous to merit serious notice. Um, yeah, well, some of these questions seem nitpicky and, a little bit even kind of sarcastic, but they are questions that you should have asked by now if you're a Christian and you've gone over this uh, Matthew 27. That uh, but most likely because you have been taught that the Bible is the Word of God, that you're not supposed to question these things, and you just read it over and you just said, wow, all the saints came out of their graves. And you just then went on to the next verse. But it's like, uh, what? What just happened? And you should have asked maybe not all those questions, but quite a few of them should have entered your mind to at least kind of check yourself, because you're getting carried away in uh, uh, this faith. Uh, Faith is not truth. And faith is not something that a truther should rely on um, unless there's a complete lack of evidence, uh, one way or the other. But in this case, there is a complete lack of evidence for the existence of Jesus, and there is overwhelming evidence for the not existence of him. Um, and I challenge any of you to present me with one piece of evidence for the existence of Jesus. The only evidence that there is Roman royals, friends of Caesar, Caesars or friends of Caesars. And given that it's a Roman psychological operation, that would be what you would expect, that they would write up stories about Jesus or references to Jesus to forward their psychological operation. But other than a handful of Romans who have corroborated the existence of Jesus, there isn't any evidence. And so when you move forward without evidence and with a lot of evidence pointing in the other direction, you have departed from the path of truth. Regardless of what your emotions say about it, regardless what your friends and family say about it, regardless what your culture says about it, regardless of about what the president or the 17th letter says about it, um, you're still, you have departed from the path of truth. Okay, next section. Nearly all the phenomena represented as occurring at the crucifixion of Christ are reported to have been witnessed also at the final exit of Cinyras, an ancient pagan demigod who figured in history at a still more remote period of time. And similar incidents are related likewise in the legendary histories of several other heathen demigods and great men partially promoted to the honor of gods. In the time honored records of the oldest religion in the world, it is declared, quote, a cloud surrounded the moon, and the sun was darkened at noonday, and the sky rained fire and ashes during the crucifixion of the Indian god Krishna. In the case of Osiris of Egypt, Mr. Southwell says, quote, as his birth had been attended by an eclipse of the sun, so his death was attended by a still greater darkness of the solar orb, end quote. And at the critical juncture of the crucifixion of Prometheus, it is declared, quote, the whole frame of nature became convulsed, the earth shook, the rocks were rent, the graves opened, and in a storm which threatened the dissolution of the universe, the scene closed, end quote. According to the historian Livy, um, the last hours of the mortal demise of Romulus were marked by a storm and by a solar eclipse. And similar stories are furnished us by several writers of Caesar and Alexander the Great. With respect to the latter, Mr. Nimrod says, quote, 6 hours of darkness formed his aphantasia, and his soul, like Polycarp's, uh, was seen to fly away in the form of a dove. Now, Polycarp was a second century Christian so-called martyr, and so in his in his death, he echoes the death of Jesus. Many of the Christian martyrs, um, their stories, so-called, are just as fraudulent as the story of Jesus, and they're modeled upon the story of Jesus, which is modeled upon these older stories. There's nothing in the New Testament that is original. All of it is borrowed from someone else, because it's a fiction, and they weren't creative enough to create their own story. They just borrowed it from all these other sources. Because these other sources stood the test of time and were regarded as either religion or mythology. And so they were useful for the Romans to put in there. And not only that, but they built a bridge for not only the Jews, but also for the slaves and the soldiers to kind of grab onto this story of Jesus. They were trying to ultimately create a universal religion. In the first place, they wanted to mellow out the Jews, but they also recognized that this could be applied to the people at large. And again, the Romans wanted you to be a good person. They wanted you to be hardworking and honest. So they're not going to put in, a lot of stuff that, so they're naturally going to put in stuff that is, you know, um, spiritually valuable in some way. So just the fact that there is uh, good stuff in the New Testament doesn't mean that it's uh, authentic. Okay, it is remarkable, says a writer, what a host of respectable authorities vouch for an unacknowledged fable, the preternatural darkness which followed Caesar's death. Gibbon alludes to this event when he speaks of, quote, the singular defect of light which followed the murder of Caesar. He likewise says this season of darkness had already been celebrated by most of the poets and historians of that memorable age. It is very remarkable that Pliny the Elder speaks of a darkness attending Caesar's death, but omits to mention such a scene as attending the crucifixion of Christ. Virgil also seeks to exalt this royal personage by relating this prodigy. Another writer says similar prodigies were supposed or said to accompany the great men of former days. Let the reader make a note of this fact, that the same story was told of the graves opening and the dead rising at the final mortal exit of several heathen gods and several great men long before it was penned as a chapter in the history of Christ. Shakespeare in his Hamlet says, quote, "In the most high and palmy days of Rome, a little ere the mighty Julius fell, the graves stood tenantless, and the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the Roman streets." Now, um, Shakespeare wasn't, this is not valid either, because Shakespeare is not Shakespeare. It was a woman named Amelia Bassano, a Jewish woman, whose entire purpose in writing all 35 or so plays of Shakespeare, every one of the plays, the subject of every one of the plays is that the Romans wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. And her whole idea was the Shakespearean oeuvre was a counterattack against the Gentiles from the Jews. And so, the Romans mocked and ridiculed the Jews in the Gospels, and Shakespeare, so called, mocks and ridicules the Gentiles in the plays. And the other great writer of the time, Christopher Marlowe, was also privy to this information, as was a number of famous writers of literature throughout the ages after that, such as Cervantes, Tolstoy, Fielding, Shelley. The Frankenstein is about Jesus, and Emerson, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. There are several others, and that have all known the deal that the New Testament was actually written by the Romans. This was known by many historical authors as well. Bruno Bauer back in the 19th century, as well as the writers of the Encyclopedia Biblica at Oxford in the early 20th century, as well as James Ballantyne Hannay and Ronald Syme at Oxford, up into the present day or present era, the modern era, with Abelard Royklin's true authorship of the New Testament. And then in the 21st century, a spate of authors have finally come out with this. And unfortunately, your priest or pastor or the entire truther movement hasn't been able to inform you of this. Like, what is going on? There are millions of you out there, and none of you have dug this up yet. That shows you that you're not really digging. You're just digging for convenience. You're digging to find the things that you want to find, but the things that you don't want to find, you're not looking for them. Okay. These historical citations strongly press the conclusion that this portion of the history of Christ was borrowed from old pagan legends. Many cases are recorded in history of the light of the sun being obscured at midday so as to result in almost total darkness. when it was known not to be produced by an eclipse. And it is probable that these natural events furnished the basis, in part, for those wild legends we have brought to notice. Humboldt relates in his Cosmos that in the year 358, before the earthquake of Numidia, the darkness was very dense for 2 or 3 hours. Another obscuration of the sun took place in the year 360, which lasted 5 or 6 hours and was so dense that the stars were visible at midday. Another circumstance of this kind was witnessed on the 19th of May, 1730, which lasted 8 hours. And so great was the darkness that candles and lamps had to be lighted at midday to dine by. Similar events are chronicled for the years 1094, 1206, 1241, and 1547. And if any such solar obscurations occurred near the mortal exit of any of the gods above named, of course they would be seized on as a part of their practical history, wrought up into hyperbole and interwoven in their narratives to give éclat to the pageantry of their biographies, a fact which helps to solve the mystery. Okay, that's the end of this section. I think we're going to stop right there, and we'll be able to wrap up this chapter when we return tomorrow. The last little section here is called Origin of the Story of Athanasia. Sorry, at the crucifixion. Okay. But I guess I'll bid you adieu for today. And thanks for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe, comment. If you've got any evidence outside of the Bible for the existence of Jesus, please provide it for me. And like I've said before, it does me no joy to present this information to people, and I would be happy to be a Christian if it were the truth, but it isn't. The evidence is overwhelming in the other direction that it was a psychological operation written by the Romans against the Jews. That is the New Testament, and the story of Jesus is fictional. And if you provide me with good evidence, I will change my mind. But it has to be good evidence, because all the evidence I've seen is either not evidence from the Bible itself, or which is circular reasoning, or from the Romans, which doesn't count because it's a psychological operation. So of course some Romans are going to be corroborating the existence as part of the psychological operation. The truthers out there, you guys know what psychological operations look like. And if you examine this, you would recognize that that's exactly what this is. This is a paradigmatic version of a psychological operation, but it's only transferred into the first century as opposed to the 21st century. And there isn't a whole lot of digging that needs to be done, and that's why you all should really be ashamed for not having done it, and that I have to present it to you. So keep that in mind, because there's a lot of other things that you're missing too in your digging, but this is the most major one, because I won't say the most major, but it's among the most major ones, because we're going to win this war against the Satanists, but it's not going to do any good if we go forward as a Christian movement, because the Christians, there's a fine line there. And what we're going to end up with is the Salem witch trials all over again. Once the Christians get in power, something, they can be meek and humble in their own sphere, but the history tells you that when they get in power, they begin to start persecuting the infidels, and they begin to start torturing them until they confess to being possessed by Satan. you know that's the only thing that suffices, is a confession that you're possessed by Satan. If you haven't confessed that you've been possessed by Satan, then you need to be tortured more until you do. That's the pattern. So I'm not going with that. So I'm going to be screaming and yelling about this until somebody listens to me. Okay, like, share, subscribe, comment, and otherwise, have a great day.